Is poverty a necessary evil, or just the aftermath of corruption? If corruption ceased to exist, would poverty follow suit? These questions invite us to delve into the paradox of poverty and corruption. In our global society, where wealth is abundant, poverty persists. It's a bitter pill to swallow, isn't it? But why is this so? One possible answer lies in the murky waters of corruption. Corruption and poverty are often interconnected, a sinister tango that perpetuates a cycle of disparity. Corruption, through its various forms, often leads to increased poverty and economic inequality. It siphons off resources meant for societal upliftment, widening the gap between the haves and the have-nots. It's like a parasite, feeding off the very system it's part of, leaving in its wake a trail of destitution. As we delve deeper, we'll explore real-life cases that shed light on this paradox. Let's embark on this journey together, a journey to understand the paradox of poverty and corruption. Let's take a journey to Nigeria, a nation rich in oil resources but plagued with poverty and corruption. Despite being Africa's largest oil producer and the world's 12th largest, the vast majority of Nigeria's population lives in poverty. This paradox is a direct result of corruption. From embezzlement of oil revenues to the siphoning off of funds meant for public infrastructure, corruption has seeped into every layer of Nigeria's oil industry. The country loses an estimated $40 billion annually due to corrupt practices within this sector. That's enough to lift millions of Nigerians out of poverty. Yet, the oil wealth, instead of trickling down to the grassroots, ends up in the hands of a privileged few, widening the gap between the rich and the poor. This is Nigeria, a country where the wealth of the land does not reflect on the faces of its people. A classic example of how corruption feeds poverty, leaving the masses to suffer. Now let's shift our focus to India, a country where bureaucratic corruption is rampant. India, known for its rich culture and history, is unfortunately also recognized for its deeply rooted bureaucratic corruption. This corruption permeates every level of the government, from the local offices to the high echelons of power. The corruption within India's bureaucratic system is like a parasite, feeding off the resources meant for the development of the country and its people. It creates an uneven distribution of resources, with the poor often left empty-handed. This skewed allocation further exacerbates the issue of poverty in many regions. Imagine the countless resources that could have been used for infrastructure, healthcare, and education, all lost to the abyss of corruption. The poor are the ones who suffer the most, as they're denied access to opportunities that could lift them out of poverty. This corruption-poverty cycle continues to spin, creating a breeding ground for more corruption and deepening poverty. Again, we see how corruption creates an environment where poverty thrives. As we've seen, corruption and poverty often operate in a vicious cycle. Picture this, a domino chain. One piece falls, setting off a cascade. That's how corruption and poverty interact. When corruption is rampant, resources meant for public good are diverted, causing underdevelopment and poverty. And what happens when people are stuck in the mire of poverty? They're pushed into a corner, forced to pay bribes just to access basic services. Corruption then becomes a survival mechanism in a system that's rigged against them. It's a twisted dance of cause and effect, each feeding into the other. This cycle, this domino effect, is not just a concept. It's the harsh reality for millions around the world, and it's a cycle that once started is hard to break. But we must remember, dominoes can only fall if they're set up to do so. So the question becomes, who's setting up the dominoes? The question remains, if corruption ends, will poverty follow? We've journeyed through the paradox of poverty and corruption, witnessed the devastation in Nigeria and the bureaucratic corruption in India, and seen the domino effect of these issues. Now we turn our attention to solutions, to breaking this vicious cycle. In the face of such grand issues, it's easy to feel powerless, but change is possible. The path to change lies in improving governance, ensuring transparency, and implementing economic reforms. Good governance creates the foundation for fair distribution of resources. Transparency checks misuse of power, and economic reforms can stimulate growth, reducing the gap between the rich and poor. The fight against corruption and poverty is a collective one. It calls for a global commitment to uphold justice, protect the vulnerable, and ensure that everyone gets a fair chance to thrive. While there's no easy answer, one thing is clear: to tackle poverty, we must first address corruption.